Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the impact of mandatory charging policy on abused women in Ottawa. My name is Holly Johnson. I'm the Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, and I'm joined by Deborah, who is a postdoctoral fellow working with me on this project. This project was funded by MyTax, which is an agency that typically has, up until recently, funded businesses to work together with researchers, and they've just extended that to include nonprofit organizations. And they will fund projects such as ours, with a professor and a postdoc working with community agencies in a way that's going to benefit communities, with some matched funding. So our community partners are the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women, coordinating committees across the province, as well as Building a Bigger Wave. And they very creatively crowdsourced the matched funding for this project. So it's been quite a collaboration. I'm going to ask those of you who are participating in the webinar to hold your questions until the end. We're planning to go until 2 o'clock because that's what it was advertised for, but we're happy to stay longer if there are questions from people online that we haven't covered. Yes, and you can pose your questions through the chat function. If you have technical difficulties, please contact Elsa, who is the moderator. Okay, let's begin. As you know, mandatory charging policies came in. Mandatory charging policies came in the early 80s when the Federal Solicitor General suggested, well, mandated the RCMP to begin with mandatory charging and suggested police departments across the country do the same. And Ontario has perhaps one of the most rigorous and extensive mandatory charging policies in our country, and Canada as a whole has one of the most aggressive criminal justice responses to intimate partner violence of any country. And what this policy does is it puts the onus on police officers to lay a charge, thus relieving women of that responsibility so that they can't be pressured to drop the charges. And in 2009, the Ontario Domestic Violence Advisory Council advised or recommended to the government that there be some research or evaluation of this policy to see how it's actually working for women, for police, for service providers. And that was never done. And so we've picked up that call to examine the benefits and the consequences of this policy. So we conducted this project where we asked for the input of abused women, service providers, and police. So we're going to present the results of this project today. And just to start off, to give you an idea of, of the extent or the wide range of responses that we received. One woman says, I think the mandatory charging policy is a good idea. At least it lets the woman have an opportunity to get some distance from the violent partner, whether they want it or not. So what we've done is indicated in brackets some characteristics of the individuals who are providing these quotations. So this woman thought it was a good policy generally, and she's more willing to report now that she knows about the policy. At the other end, of the spectrum, this woman says, removing all power and control from a woman in this circumstance is simply a similar experience with being abused. It's one more person who has the power to make choices for you. I was calling police for support and safety, not to take over my life. There was no part of that process that enabled me or empowered me. So what we're going to be doing is presenting both qualitative data in quotations like this, as well as statistical data. But this is sort of a wide range, just a short indication of the wide range of responses we received from abused women. So the focus of our research then is women's experiences of mandatory charging. What are the benefits and the negative consequences for abused women from the perspective of women, service providers, and police? Did they know about the policy? Would it change their willingness to report to the police in the future now that they know about it, how helpful they found the police, how satisfied they were with the process, and recommendations for improving the policy. So in the methodology, phase one of our project was to review the research literature that actually talked to women about the policy and its implications for them. And so Deborah's going to be providing a brief overview of that. And from there, we developed a questionnaire, or 3 questionnaires, with input from our community partners. So that was through focus groups, that was through teleconference calls with our advisory committee, that was through individual feedback from community partners. And we were successful in recruiting almost 300 women, almost 300 service providers, and over 100 police officers. So we want to extend our sincere thanks to those who participated and took the time to complete these online surveys. When we were designing the project, and it's much more efficient for gathering data, for ensuring anonymity, to conduct surveys online. Most people are fairly familiar with computers and are happy to do that, but we recognize that what it does is it leaves out women who don't have access to technology or are not comfortable using it. So we made the offer to interview women who came forward, and unfortunately only one did. So we interviewed one woman by telephone. Another limitation to the survey, it was only conducted in English or French. And so it does eliminate the possibility of women participating who weren't familiar in the 2 official languages. To be eligible to participate, for the women, they had to be 18 years or older. The abuse happened within the last 5 years because we wanted a current snapshot. They had to be living in Ontario, living as a woman at the time and currently. Service providers and police had to have been working with survivors in the past 5 years. So we're looking for recent experience. Sorry, there's quite a delay with the slide. Okay, so just very briefly, there's a lot of data here, but what it shows you, I think, is we did get quite good diversity in other characteristics of the women responding, although language, obviously, and ethnicity was not one. The women were quite diverse in terms of their age. We asked about gender, and there were more categories of gender here, but I didn't put up the ones that for which there were zeros. So we asked about, whether they were female, male, transgender, two-spirited, genderqueer, or gender nonconforming, and most were female. Ethnicity, we got an overrepresentation of Indigenous women compared to their makeup in the population, which was a good thing. Other types of ethnicity, we didn't do so well. Disability, half of the women had a disability, either a physical or a mental health condition. We had some diversity in sexual orientation. Education at the time of the assault, we had just 20% of women had under a high school diploma or less. We had about a third of our women had a high school or university, at least some university or a degree, and quite a bit of diversity in household income. I should say, too, that despite this, we don't know how representative these women are of all abused women. So women came forward, service providers were self-selected in, and so were police, and so it's we have to be careful about generalizations we make on the basis of this data. Service providers, about 2/3 were in the violence against women sector, which is shelters and transition houses and sexual assault centers. We had a good representation of PAR programs, about 18% of our sample. We had some children's aid, some hospital-based, some victim services, fewer family counseling or corrections or Aboriginal services, some public health, social services, mental health, and addiction, so a good variety there. We had quite a range in terms of experience. So about half of the sample of service providers were working in the field for over 10 years. So about half below 10 years. And most were female, but we did have some male and two-spirited. Sorry, there's a delay in the slides here. The sample of police as well. 42% were patrol officers and about the same were partner assault investigators. So we have a good split there. We have a few sergeants and a couple of commanders. Years working in policing, again, there was a split of 62% were in policing for 10 years or more. So we have some very experienced ones and some less experienced ones. Interestingly, 58% were female. And we know that females are underrepresented in policing, but they're overrepresented in our kind of interesting. Okay, I'm going to pass it to Deborah.
Whoops. Hello, everybody. I'm going to look at the literature with you next, the research in this topic, which is where we started when we were doing the project, both to get a sense of what issues should be in the questionnaire and also to see if there was a framing of some questions that we might actually use that would then allow us to compare to the results of other studies. So to begin, just to put it in a context, there are many debates among feminists regarding the use of the law to address violence against women, and specifically around mandatory arrest policies. Mandatory policies were implemented to make sure that domestic violence was addressed seriously by the justice system. However, some critics have argued that mandatory arrest policies tend to be applied as a one-size-fits-all solution that does not respond to women's unique situations. And there are also concerns that mandatory charging shifts decision-making authority from victims to police, thus increasing the power of the state and further disempowering some women. Notwithstanding these concerns, few critics would argue to abandon pro-charging policies, as they can respond to the immediate safety needs of women and also help condemn the violence. Our specific research findings, not our findings, the findings in the literature, many women survivors endorse mandatory policies in general. There's also a gap. They show less support for mandatory policies in their own particular case. For instance, Beretta and Schneider found a 90% support for mandatory policies as a good thing for most women most of the time, and 72% support in their own cases. Some of the explanations that have been put forward for this gap are that women are more aware of the specific dangers, perhaps, that they face, or they see the love that they have for their partner as a mitigating factor, or they have need for the support of their partner, or they feel a need to support their partner. So there's a lot of pieces there that come into play. Indigenous and racialized women feel greater negative impacts as the policy can be more harshly applied in their communities. That's something we saw in the literature. And interestingly, though, Smith found that there was less support among white women than African American women for the policy. So there's variations here, and what we wanted to do in looking at this literature, and we've just pulled 3 themes out to show you, is to say, well, what can we do with this when we're designing our survey? So one of the things we did was we created a question that asked, are mandatory policies a good thing for most women most of the time? And we also asked about in your own specific case. So we used those same questions. Women's needs and goals are a dynamic response to an ongoing and changing personal situation. And the justice system is static. It has an institutionalized policies and procedures that it follows. So that's one source of the tension that we see. The goals of some women when they call the police are to stop the violence rather than prosecute their partner. That was a finding from Burgess and Proctor. Another study showed that women are often accurate in their assessment of whether a charge would increase their risk of violence. And finally, in New Brunswick, some immigrant women expressed concerns with increased social isolation, fear of the police, and increased economic insecurity. So those are the issues that we found in the literature that we wanted to bring into our study. And you hit that button, yes. So we're going to move on, when the machine is ready, to experiences that Ontario women expressed with the police and with the policy in our study. So beginning with contact with the police. I believe that it's really going to happen. Okay. Women were invited to discuss violence or abuse in their most recent relationship, whether or not they had contacted the police. And overall, half of the women, 49%, had had contact with the police, and 61% of these had contact with the police more than once. Reporting rates were higher for English-speaking than for French-speaking women. Some unreported cases involve violence that was quite serious. For instance, 20% of women who suffered physical injuries, serious enough to warrant medical attention, and 37% of women who were very afraid of their partners did not report to the police. The reasons that women gave for not contacting the police were varied, and I'll take you through some of those, but we'd like to begin with a quote from one of them. She says, "I would never call them, the police, for help, specifically because of this policy. There are many times that I would have called for help because I wanted him to be taken away that night or until he was sober, but I don't call because of the long-term consequences." So the reasons, there's 165 women in our study who didn't have contact with the police in their most recent relationship. And the reasons for not reporting that were police-related were that the police involvement might make things worse, that they didn't think that the police would actually help stop the violence, that they had no evidence or proof, they didn't trust the police, they had had negative experiences with the police in the past, or that their partner is a police officer. There were 9 Indigenous women and 7 ethnic minority women in the study who didn't report to the police, and they were more likely to cite a lack of trust in the police than white women. It was 38% compared to 15% of Caucasian women. And also they cited negative experiences in the past, 31%, at 31%, quite high, compared to 8%. And here's another quote: "As a woman of color who is now in law school, I still do not trust the police, and I never will. They wield too much power and have never been helpful for me. It would take a lot for me to ever contact them." So there were also reasons that women gave that were apart from the justice system, and they're coming. Almost half of women said they didn't think the violence was serious enough, or they thought it was partly their fault. Close to 40% said they hoped the violence would stop, or that the violence might actually get worse if they reported it. 25% didn't know how to ask for help, which I think is a significant one for us to think about. They felt a responsibility to support their partner. They were worried about their partner going to jail or getting a criminal record, or their partner stopped them from asking for help. And then the last group here are those that were reported by less than 20% of women. They didn't know it was a crime, what was happening. Their partner... Now we are? Okay. Slide is here. They didn't know it was a crime. Their partner might lose their job. They were interested in keeping, or they felt that it threatened keeping the family together. They had a fear that their partner might kill them. Their partner threatened, which was 16%. That's significant. Their partner threatened to have them charged. Shame or protecting the partner. They didn't have support, or they felt isolated.
Okay, here we are. All right, when the police were contacted, and that was in half of the cases, we can see here that police laid charges in only half against the abusive partner. And they laid charges against the women only in 5% of cases, and just one, and that's one case, and 1% we have of dual charging. So we hear a lot about dual charging, but we don't have more than one case in our study to be able to examine that in any detail. So in 39% of cases, no charges were heard. This is not unlike, I mean, this is the context of a mandatory charging policy. And this is not unlike the results that came out of a recent study that we did with women in Ottawa, and not dissimilar to the statistics produced by the Ottawa police themselves. So it raises a few questions right off the bat. We asked the women whether they wanted charges laid. And interestingly, about a quarter said no. About a third wanted them, and about a third were unsure. They didn't know about whether they wanted to involve their partners in the criminal justice system and themselves. So what we see here is that police tended to charge according to the women's wishes. So in about 2/3 of cases, police laid charges. In over half of cases where women didn't want them, police didn't lay charges. And importantly, when women were unsure, police tended to lay charges, almost as often as when the women wanted. We asked about the helpfulness of the police contact and according to whether the partner was charged or not. Oh, okay. So if you look at the group of bars over to the right with total underneath, that's the whole sample. So we asked of those reported to the police. So how helpful was the police? We have about a quarter who said very, about just over a third that said somewhat, and a third that said they weren't helpful at all. They're more likely to feel that the police response was helpful if partner was charged, that's the group in the center, than if the partner was not charged. But what's interesting to me is if you look at the group with not charged, we have 39% of women said the police were somewhat helpful, even if they weren't charged. We have almost a half that said they weren't helpful. But what that suggests is that the police are doing something helpful to the women, even though charges aren't laid. I just got a quotation coming up here. So, two women. One says, they arranged for me to meet with them at a neutral location. They initiated a conversation with my ex and kept him away from me and occupied while I was able to get my things. So he wasn't charged. She thought that the police actions were very helpful. She was very satisfied with the outcome. And she said, it depends. Good, bad policy, that depends. But she's more willing to report now that she knows about it. Once the police contacted him, all threats stopped immediately. So police can effectively help women stop the violence without laying charges, it would appear. And there are other things that they can do that women find helpful, although when charges are not laid is when women find it least helpful. I just want to touch for a minute on the women who were charged. So who are they? So these women, it ranged from defensive action against violence perpetrated against them, fabrications by the partner, and one woman who said that she hit her partner. The first one says, I explained to the police that I hit my partner to defend myself and I got charged with domestic abuse and did 6 months probation. This is after the fact that my partner is well known to police and has a long violent record. I really do not believe I deserve to have a record now because I'm a victim of his abuse. This is just another way the abuse continues to play out within society. So this is a woman who is very afraid of her partner. Someone else contacted the police and both she and her partner were charged. Another woman said, everything that my partner did to me, he turned around and told the police I was the one who did them. They never even asked me why I originally called or asked any questions. Just listened to his story of what I apparently did to him and laid charges immediately. This woman who was charged and her partner wasn't. Another woman said, interestingly, I hit my partner because he cheated on me and I was stressed out. So someone else contacted the police and she said it was good for her in her case because she learned how to deal with her anger.
So, yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Deborah. I think we've been offline, although we were talking away, not realizing that. So here we are looking at the perceptions that the participants had of the policy. You can see that the police had said that mandatory charging was good for most women most of the time at a rate of 45%, service providers at 68%, and women at 51%. And the other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is a fairly high percentage, almost a third, saying that it was other than good or bad. The next question that we want to talk about is that we asked women if it was a good or bad policy for themselves. So we have two columns here. One of them is the responses for most women most of the time, and the other column is for themselves. So you can see that it's slightly lower in saying that it's a good policy for themselves in their own situation. And we expected that from what we had read in the literature. We have a quote here. This is from a woman who said it was good policy. I was so controlled for so long by my husband that I could not think clearly enough to know that his abuse was wrong enough to involve the police. All it would have taken was an arched eyebrow from him to make me confused and afraid enough to take it all back. A quote from a woman who said it had good and bad qualities, and for her specifically, it was good because her partner was able to receive the help that he needed. And then a bad policy for most women. This woman says, there are times when we may need help to calm our partner down. We may not want them charged. Who can we turn to if there is a mandatory charge policy? We also have perceptions from the police, and here's a quote. For the most part, it is good. However, there are enough circumstances that are severely impacted in a negative way where it would be better if police were able to use some discretion and make a decision on, right. Sorry, I'm reading a different quote. So the one that you have on your slide is, for the most part, it's a good policy, but I've seen cases where women had no intention to have their partners charged. Sometimes this leads to recanting of their statement or outright change in their statement, resulting in public mischief charges. This is a male detachment commander with over 10 years experience. Now, we were a little surprised by this, or just wanting to check out this idea of public mischief charges. And so we talked to an OPS officer here who's on the advisory committee for this project, or no, he's just on the Justice Committee. So we've talked to him, and he said he's never seen that happen, and it just, and it shouldn't. So we have, doesn't mean it doesn't. So that's what we have, right? The thing about a survey like this is that we're not able to do a statistical analysis of whether it happens or doesn't happen. We just have somebody who's or an ability to follow up either, since it's completely anonymous. But these things raise the issues to be discussed, right? The perceptions of the service providers. The impact of abuse can be extremely immobilizing on the victim. The victim's and her children's safety is increased if the law takes control of the situation. So this is showing the range of perceptions from the service provider. So that was on the one side. And then the other side is mandatory charging is good when it's power and control and bad when it's situational violence. Okay. For both the service providers and the police, the support for the policy rose with the number of years working in the field. And for the service providers, of those who've worked in the field for more than 5 years, 74% said it was a good policy most of the time. And it was 50% for those with fewer than 5 years experience. The same thing was the case with the police, where those working in policing for over 10 years were more likely to consider it a good policy versus those with fewer than 10. Support for the policy by sector. So the service providers' views also varied by sector from 86% down to 62%. You can see the range there. Public health, social services, victim services, corrections were at the high end. PAR outreach with female victims, mental health addictions, PAR working with charged women, and the VAW sector were at the low end of that. And we're going to shift back to Holly, and she's going to talk about the benefits and consequences.
Okay. I think one of the important findings that Deborah mentioned, and it could have been while our audio wasn't working for our online participants, is what the women who were most positive about the policy were those who weren't sure if they wanted their partners charged and the police charged. So 84% of those women who phoned the police, not sure where they wanted it to go, and the police laid charges on their behalf, they were the group that were most who were most likely to say it was a good policy for them. So we asked about benefits. And I think in a survey like this, if you list 27 benefits and you ask, are these benefits for you, you'll get everybody going tick, 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 tick. So we asked our respondents to identify the top 5. So these are the top 5, the percentage of each of these groups who named each benefit as among the top 5. And what's interesting, and there's 3 slides here of the benefits, there's many of them. What's interesting is that the women don't always see the same benefits as the police or the service providers, and the same with the negative consequences. What stands out here is the second set, women not laying charges. That was the purpose of the policy, right? To take that responsibility out of women's hands. And there's a lot of agreement among our 3 groups that that's one of the top 5. Women's top benefit was that it helps them to leave. So once the police are called, and I think women, generally don't call the police unless they're ready to make a change, like leaving. That was true for 82% of them. Other areas where women kind of stand out is being told the abuse is wrong. And we had some interesting quotations from women who said, I didn't know it was wrong. I was told by my mother that I should just go back and, deal with it, or I was so confused, or I was controlled, or whatever. And this was the most important thing to me. They get connected to resources. They feel safer. It's interesting that police and service providers are less likely to see that as one of the top benefits, as women are safer. And they can make changes in their own lives to reduce the danger. So with the help of the police involvement. And, there are other ways that service providers are different from police. More likely to say connecting women to resources, for example, is a top benefit. Women are safer. So the women and their children are safer. Women and their children are safer. They're similar to police and service providers in thinking the partners are told the abuse is wrong, so that the police come in and they say this is wrong and we're going to lay charges against you. Women aren't pressured to drop charges. This was a main purpose of the policy, and they're more or less similar in identifying that. The police, understandably, are more likely to say, well, it helps us to identify repeat offenders, but women identify that in 29% of cases too. And women want to see their partners connected to resources. So they see that as a benefit of police involvement, that it helps them connect their partners as well as themselves to resources. They see that their partners attempt to change, which is interesting because that's what they want. I mean, mostly they want the partners to change. They want themselves to be safer. We asked about CAS involvement, and a fairly large proportion, almost 1 in 5 of each of our groups, thought that involvement was helpful. Kind of interesting. Women are more likely to see that partners end their abusive behavior. Small number think their relationships improve. And the police, of course, they are looking for a consistent response. So they say this is the benefit of the policy, is that the police respond in a consistent fashion. And we didn't ask women that question. That's why there's a 0 there. Yeah. Okay. So here's just a couple of quotations of benefits. I suspect that had my partner not been removed from my home when he was, I would have sustained much more serious injury or death. I think mandatory charging can be helpful most of the time, as it may be the woman's first and only opportunity to have someone stand up to her abuser. The key to this is to have educated, insightful, experienced police officers on the scene who are able to take the time and address the dynamics of power and control. So this was a service provider in this case. In terms of the negative consequences, we asked the same thing, identify the top negative consequences. And I think what's important to remember is that women are speaking about their own experience. We're service providers and police. Some of them have been dealing with hundreds of women over decades, right? And so their responses are based on what they know in many, many, many cases. Despite the fact that they see it as a benefit that the police, women don't have responsibility to lay charges, women are more likely than the other two groups to say that the partners are angry and take it out on the women. So we saw reasons for not reporting, sometimes where that women were afraid of the consequences on themselves. And when they do call the police and charges are laid, then sometimes they are threatened. They're very concerned about the penalties. So they are more likely than the other two groups to say the penalties don't have any effect, or the conditions are not enforced. So yeah, I had a restraining order, but it wasn't useful. And service providers are close behind on that one. So they say, yeah, you can charge, but then the criminal justice system doesn't follow up on it. Partners don't get help, so we see that again. Loss of control. So yes, it takes the responsibility off the women, but about 3 in 10 of all of our groups feel that women do lose control in this process. And police, interestingly, this was, I believe, the top negative to them, was that what they see is when women are in court and going through the criminal justice system, that they're not prepared for the impact on their lives. And we do have quotations from women who say, you know, I was in court for 3 years and dealing with financial problems and that kind of thing. The partners draw out the process. The partners threaten to get the women charged. So about a quarter of the women say yes to those two, or their community turns against them. The police are more likely to identify financial problems. And interestingly, 60% of them almost say that one of the negative consequences is that women don't want their partners charged. And so bear in mind, again, they're talking about hundreds of cases that they're dealing with. The women themselves are very unlikely to say that in their own case. Okay, and finally, negative consequences. Service providers, more than the other two, are more likely to say that partners lie or exaggerate to have the women charged. There's also a concern that the violence and abuse gets worse after charges, the relationship gets worse. Women are left in limbo, and you know the main breadwinner is gone, or they don't have financial support. And shelter workers and women more likely to say negative consequences that women are having to move out and to live in shelters. Oh, I do have one more. Sorry. Police, again, financial issues about the loss of the primary breadwinner. The women, about 1 in 10, say that his criminal record affects his ability to work, or he reports her to Children's Aid Society, Ontario Works, or ODSP. That wasn't asked of the other two groups. Children's Aid Society not being helpful was kind of a standout for service providers. And again, they witness or they experience a lot more cases than women do, or that the Children's Aid Society takes the children. Okay, so just one quotation from a male supervisor of partner violence investigative section and police officer, obviously. A woman victim wanted to have charges dropped in a minor assault case, citing wanting to go to counseling that dealt with abuse, but also other contributing factors like financial. The Crown refused to drop the charges. The victim began to hide from her life to avoid being served a subpoena for court. She stopped staying at home, and police coming to workplace began to cause issues with her employer. In the end, it was the police that went to the Crown to have charges stayed, citing victimization of the victim, as the state was now abusing her. So he saw the really aggressive mandatory charging policies to be victimizing women when they didn't want charges laid. And Deborah's going to talk about knowledge of the policy.
Okay, so we asked women if they knew about the policy before the last incident of violence that they had experienced. And that last incident is what we've been asking them to refer to throughout the survey. Almost 60% of abused women in the survey did not know about mandatory charging during the last incident of violence they experienced. Then we asked them, we told them about mandatory charging, about that policy, and we asked them, now that you know about it, what's the effect of that knowledge on your willingness to call the police in the future? And just over 1/4 of women said they would be more willing, under 1/4 were less willing, and 1/3 said there'd be no change, and then another 17 said they weren't sure or they didn't give an answer to that. So this data suggests that increasing public awareness of the policy wouldn't have a net impact on reporting. Oh, and then we're going back to Holly.
Okay, so last, we asked our 3 groups about improving the policy. So what could we do to improve it? And some general themes came out of that. I think first and most importantly was the idea that, you know, great policy, but if the other supports aren't there, then this is where it all falls apart. There needs to be expanded social supports, also enforcement of things like no contact orders. Financial issues are important to address, particularly housing. The emotional upheaval causes a lot of problems, so we need support around that. And the information about the criminal justice system, if that's not there, then it's very, very difficult for women to go through that. And associated with that is protection. So when charges are laid, the situation becomes more dangerous if the abuser violates court orders and other supports are not there. Training for police always comes up, particularly on the dynamics and the psychological effects of abuse, on trauma-informed approaches, empathy for victims, and determination of primary aggressor. And although we didn't have more than one woman who is an example of dual charging, we did have a few women who were charged by the police, and so that was raised more by service providers, that there needs to be more on primary aggressor. And one, I think, service provider raised the idea of having counselors present when police respond, so that police can do their work and that there's more of a kind of a supportive role available to women as well. Now, police thought they should have more discretion, and there's some service providers as well. Women talk more about choice and control. So it seems to me police are using discretion, if only half are charging, and that they are more often not charging when women don't want charges laid. There's some discretion happening there. Some felt that because the range of domestic violence is broad and complex, that mandatory charging mandatory charging may not be the route in all cases. And then, as I said, some women want more choice. Others mention it more in terms of a differential response. Officers suggested integrating a degree of discretion while striving to maintain its intended aims. So in other words, having to justify why a charge was not laid. So Service providers spoke more about the need for a differential response based on an assessment of risk. And I think the point was made too, that if there's no discretion, then there would be, if we want just always adherence to the policy, then there's more likely to be dual charging, there's more likely to be women charged. A more consistent application of the policy should be applied more consistently. The police should be better informed and better trained. Public education was an interesting one. As Deborah said, the majority of women don't know about it, but I'm not surprised about that. People don't know about criminal justice policies unless they happen to be subjected to them. And one suggested that it could possibly have a deterrent effect on abusers. If abusive men know that they could be charged by the police and there's a mandatory charging policy, it may deter their violence. Public education, including increased choice and control for women, holding police accountable, and some survivors noted that they might not have called the police had they known about the policy, but that to me presents a problem. If you're not seeking protection from the police because you're worried about losing control and charges being laid against your will. So those are some of the kinds of things that came out of it. And there's one quotation from a woman who I think sums it up really nicely. The problems of looking at a policy or expecting a policy to be effective if other supports are not available. She says, I believe the right to press charges needs to stay with the woman. Only she knows what she can handle and what her needs are. In my experience, the police, the legal system, and CAS are not equipped to deal adequately assist the woman through the process. Mandatory charging is a good idea in an ideal world, but not realistic. It requires that all professionals involved be competent, having dealt at the very least with their own personal issues, not to mention their personal biases. And in my experience, this is not the case. This then creates more problems for the woman. And if her right to press charges or not is taken away from her, this puts her into an even worse position. At least if she presses charges herself and discovers the professionals are making things worse, she can drop the charges. She isn't then stuck, hopefully, in a whirlwind of further trauma that was created by the professional. So it's the police act within the context of a whole constellation of other professionals who she felt had let her down. Okay, so we're almost at 2 o'clock. The report will be available way before the end of June, I'm told. It's being translated as we speak. It will be available on the OCTEVAW website, on the Building a Bigger Wave website, as well as on a University of Ottawa website that has yet to be determined. It will be available in English and French. And just before we end, Deborah just has a comment to make about next steps.
So the coordinating committees will receive by email a discussion guide that just asks, is there anything in the report that surprised you and what didn't surprise you? Some responses to the themes, that sort of thing. So that goes beyond our research project, which is coming to an end with putting together this report. But that conversation, we hope, will be live in the communities, and that will be something that you can look to participate in, both as a coordinating committee meeting or as individuals. And that's it. So we can take questions on the chat. So I guess people can't talk to us, but they can type in their questions on the chat, and we can stay for a little bit longer. But you were told that it was until 2, so if you need to leave, that's fine, but we'll take some more time. There's something here from Gwen O'Reilly that says lower hand. Oh, she raised it and now she's lowering it. Okay. We have 14 new chat messages. I'm not seeing any questions. There we are. This is 1:30. Is there more?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Will this webinar be available for the DVU? Okay. It's being recorded, so it will be available. Sandy says, hi, Deborah and Holly. I'm sure I'll have a few questions. Sharing the research. They all can see these as well? Okay. So Ariel said, thank you for sharing the research and helping build our capacity around the province. Don has a comment. He says, my comment, there has been an ongoing comment that mandatory charging takes the pressure off the woman. This is not always the case. I know of women who are threatened to recant their statement, avoid being subpoenaed, or lie under oath at the time of trial. So even though they can't remove the charge, there's then other places where they're involved. Okay. Do you have anything else to say about? That's more a comment than a question. Yeah. Okay. We're not seeing more questions here, so if anybody's asking a question. What you can do about it, because we're not seeing them. So Erin is suggesting that if there's further questions, you could send them to Margaret at Building a Bigger Wave, and that she can pass them on to us. We're back up at 1:30. If Margaret's here, she can type in her. If Margaret is here, you could type in your email. There she is. Margaret says we're going to share the discussion guide and talk at local tables and then share the info. Gwen O'Reilly said, thanks for this work. I would comment that MCP do not serve as a deterrent to abusive men. They have learned to use them to their advantage. And Dawn asked, what's the next step? So I think that's Margaret's response, was we're going to share the discussion guide and talk at local tables and then share the input across Ontario. Margaret says, we will gather up the input by survey. Somebody else is saying something. Oh, yes, I heard a beep. Okay. Do we have any questions here in the room? And I can repeat them out loud and then respond to them. No. No. Yeah, we had okay, so the question is that there were not many immigrant women participating in the survey, and why that might be, or how that might affect the results. The second one. Yeah, that there are particular consequences that we didn't capture in this survey. Yeah. So the citizenship status of the participants was 93% citizen, 2% landed immigrant, and 4% were visa or visitor. So we had 300 women, so that translates to about 6 landed immigrants. Oh, 7 and 12. Okay. Yes, so we could only do the survey in English or French, and it relied on having access to a computer one way or another. A number of organizations provided access when they provided a private space and women could use their computer. But there definitely was a lack of capturing that group. It's partly because of those two things, right? The resources. This wasn't a research project that's funded with expenses and translation dollars and all of that. My tax is to fund a postdoctoral fellow to go to an organization and work with them. So that was all the money we had. So we weren't able to do a lot of extra things in that way that could relate to that. This survey could be the basis to do more work. We also would want to adapt the questions to do a focus group or to see how it needs to be changed to actually be responsive to the issues. Harmy says, women with precarious immigration status and how to integrate them in the future. A similar question. And again, this project is over, and I hope to actually get a full-time permanent job, but there will be other postdoctoral students coming along who would be, I'm sure, fascinated and interested and thrilled to be working in this area. Anything you want to add? So we have some thank yous, very interesting. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I think we're ready to close. And thank you all for being here and taking the time to hear our results. And we look forward to seeing what happens with this research in the future.